Chapter 8. The morrow dawned after an all but sleepless night, harrowed by the most torturesome dreams in regard to Roberta, men who arrived to arrest him, and the hike, until at last he arose, his nerves and eyes aching. Then, venturing to come downstairs about an hour later, he saw Frederick, the chauffeur who had driven him out the day before, getting one of the cars out, and thereupon instructing him to bring all the morning Albany and Utica papers. And about 9:30, when he returned, proceeding to his room with them, where, locking the door and spreading one of the papers before him, he was immediately confronted by the startling headlines: "Mystery in Girl's Death, Body Found Yesterday in Adirondack Lake, Man Companion Missing." And at once strained and wide he sat down in one of the chairs near the window and began to read: "Bridgeburg, N.Y., July 9. The body of an unknown girl, presumably the wife of a young man who registered first on Wednesday morning at Grass Lake Inn, Grass Lake, N.Y., as Carl Graham and wife, and later, Thursday noon, at Big Bittern Lodge, Big Bittern, as Clifford Golden and wife, was taken from the waters of the south end of Big Bittern just before noon yesterday. Because of an upturned boat, as well as a man's straw hat found floating on the water in Moon Cove, dredging with hooks and lines had been going on all morning. Up to 7 o'clock last evening, however, the body of the man had not as yet been recovered, and according to Coroner Height of Bridgeburg, who by 2 o'clock had been summoned to the scene of the tragedy, it was not considered at all likely that it would be. Several marks and abrasions found upon the dead girl's head and face, as well as the testimony of 3 men who arrived on the scene while the search was still on and testified to having met a young man who answered to the description of Golden or Graham in the woods to the south of the lake the night before, caused many to conclude that a murder had been committed and that the murderer was seeking to make his escape. The girl's brown leather traveling bag, as well as a hat and coat belonging to her, were left, the bag in the ticket agent's room at Gun Lodge, which is the railway station 5 miles east of Big Bittern, and the hat and coat in the coat room of the inn at the lake, whereas Granmore Golden is said to have taken his suitcase with him into the boat. According to the innkeeper at Big Bittern, the couple on their arrival registered as Clifford Golden and wife of Albany. They remained in the inn but a few minutes before Golden walked to the boat landing just outside and procured a light boat, in which, accompanied by the girl and his suitcase, he went out on the lake. They did not return, and yesterday morning the boat was found bottom-side up in what is known as Moon Cove, a small bay or extension at the extreme south end of the lake, from the waters of which soon afterwards the body of the young woman was recovered. As there are no known rocks in the lake at that point, and the wounds upon the face are quite marked, suspicion was at once aroused that the girl might have been unfairly dealt with. This, together with the testimony of the 3 men, as well as the fact that a man's straw hat found nearby contained no lining or other method of identification, has caused Coroner Height to assert that unless the body of the man is found he will assume that murder has been committed. Golden or Graham, as described by innkeepers and guests and guides at Grass Lake and Big Bittern, is not more than 24 or 25 years of age, slender, dark, and not more than 5 feet 8 or 9 inches tall. At the time he arrived he was dressed in a light gray suit, tan shoes, and a straw hat, and carried a brown suitcase to which was attached an umbrella and some other object, presumably a cane. The hat and coat left by the girl at the inn were of dark and light tan respectively, her dress a dark blue. Notice has been sent to all railroad stations in this vicinity to be on the lookout for Golden, or Graham, in order that he may be arrested if he is alive and attempts to make his escape. The body of the drowned girl is to be removed to Bridgeburg, the county seat of this county, where an inquest is later to be held. In frozen silence he sat and pondered. For would not the news of such a dastardly murder as this now appeared to be, together with the fact that it had been committed in this immediate vicinity, stir up such marked excitement as to cause many, perhaps all, to scan all goers and comers everywhere in the hope of detecting the one who had thus been described? Might it not be better, therefore, since they were so close on his trail already, If he were to go to the authorities at Big Bitter Nor here and make a clean breast of all that had thus far occurred, the original plot and the reasons therefor, only explaining how at the very last he had not really killed her, had experienced a change of heart and had not been able to do as he had planned? But, no. That would be to give away to Sandra and the Griffiths all that had been going on between him and Roberta, and before it was absolutely certain that all was ended for him here. And besides, would they believe him now, after that flight, those reported wounds? Did it not really look as though he had killed her, regardless of how he might try to explain that he had not? It was not unlikely also that at least some among all those who had seen him would be able to detect him from this printed description, even though he no longer wore the gray suit or the straw hat. God! They were looking for him, or rather for that Clifford Golden or Carl Graham who looked like him, in order to charge him with murder. But if he looked exactly like Clifford Golden and those three men came, he began to shiver. And worse yet. A new and horrible thought, this. And at this instant, and for the first time flashing upon his mind, the similarity of those initials to his own. He had never thought of them in an unfavorable light before, but now he could see that they were detrimental. Why was it that he had never thought of that before? Why was it? Why was it? Oh, God! Just then a telephone call for him came from Sandra. It was announced as from her. Yet even so he was compelled to brace himself in order to make even an acceptable showing, vocally. How was her sick boy this morning? Any better? How dreadful that illness last night to come on him so suddenly. Was he really all right now? And was he going to be able to go on the trip all right? That was fine. She had been so frightened and so worried all night for fear he might be too sick to want to go. But he was going, so everything was all right again now. Darling. Precious baby. Did her baby boy love her so? She was just sure that the trip would do him a lot of good. But until noon, now, dear, she would be using all her spare time getting ready, but at 1, or 1:30, everybody would be at the casino pier. And then, oh, my. Ho. For a great old time up there. He was to come with Bertine and Grant and whoever else was coming from there, and then at the pier he could change to Stuart's launch. They were certain to have so much fun, just loads of it, but just now she would have to go. Bye-bye. And once more like a bright-colored bird she was gone. But 3 hours to wait before he could leave here and so avoid the danger of encountering anyone who might be looking for Clifford Golden or Carl Graham. Still until then he could walk up the lake shore into the woods, couldn't he or sit below, his bag all packed, and watch who, if anybody, might approach along the long winding path from the road or by launch across the lake. And if he saw anyone who looked at all suspicious, he could take flight, could he not? And afterwards doing just that, first walking away into the woods and looking back, as might a hunted animal. Then later returning and sitting or walking, but always watching, watching. What man was that? What boat was that? Where was it going? Was it coming here, by any chance? Who was in it? Supposing an officer, a detective? Then flight, of course, if there was still time, but, at last 1 o'clock, and the Cranston launch, with Bertine and Harley and Wynette, as well as Grant and himself, setting out for the pier. And once there, joined by all who were going, together with the servants. And at Little Fish Inlet, 30 miles north, on the eastern shore, they were met by the cars of the Baggots, Harriots and others, from where, with their goods and canoes, they were portaged 40 miles east to Bear Lake, as lonely and as arresting almost as Big Bittern itself. The joy of this trip, if only that other thing were not hanging over him now. This exquisite pleasure of being near Sandra, her eyes constantly telling him how much she cared. And her spirits flame so high because of his presence here with her now. And yet Roberta's body up. That search for Clifford Golden, Carl Graham. His identical description wired as well as published everywhere. These others, all of them in their boats and cars, had probably read it. And yet, because of their familiarity with him and his connections, Sandra, the Griffiths, not suspecting him, not thinking of the description even. But if they should. If they should guess. The horror. The flight. The exposure. The police. The first to desert him, these, all save Sandra perhaps. And even she, too. Yes, she, of course. The horror in her eyes. And then that evening at sundown, on the west shore of this same lake, on an open sward that was as smooth as any well-kept lawn, the entire company settled, in 5 different colored tents ranged about a fire like an Indian village, with cooks' and servants' tents in the distance. And the half-dozen canoes beached like bright fish along the grassy shore of the lake. And then supper around an open fire. And Bagot and Harriet and Stuart and Grant, after furnishing music for the others to dance by, organizing by the flare of a large gasoline lamp, a poker game. And the others joining in singing ribald camping and college songs, no one of which Clyde knew, yet in which he tried to join, and shouts of laughter. And bets as to who would be the first to catch the first fish, to shoot the first squirrel or partridge, to win the first race. And lastly, solemn plans for moving the camp at least 10 miles farther east, after breakfast, on the morrow where was an ideal beach, and where they would be within 5 miles of the Matissac Inn, and where they could dine and dance to their heart's content. And then the silence and the beauty of this camp at night, after all had presumably gone to bed. The stars. The mystic, shadowy water, faintly rippling in a light wind, the mystic, shadowy pines conferring in the light breezes, the cries of night birds and owls, too disturbing to Clyde to be listened to with anything but inward distress. The wonder and glory of all this, if only he were not stalked after, as by a skeleton, by the horror not only of what he had done in connection with Roberta but the danger and the power of the law that deemed him a murderer. And then Sandra, the others having gone to bed, or off into the shadow, stealing out for a few last words and kisses under the stars. And he whispering to her how happy he was, how grateful for all her love and faith, and at one point almost tempted to ask whether, in case it should ever appear that he was not as good as she now seemed to imagine him, she would still love him a little, not hate him entirely, yet refraining for fear that after that exhibition of terror the preceding night she might connect his present mood with that, or somehow with the horrible, destructive secret that was gnawing at his vitals. And then afterwards, lying in the 4-cot tent with Bagot, Harriet, and Grant, listening nervously for hours for any prowling steps that might mean, God, what might they not mean even up here ? The law. Arrest. Exposure. Death. And waking twice in the night out of dread, destructive dreams, and feeling as though, and fearing, that he had cried out in his sleep. But then the glory of the morning once more, with its rotund and yellow sun rising over the waters of the lake, and in a cove across the lake wild ducks paddling about. And after a time Grant and Stuart and Harley, half-clad and with guns and a great show of fowling skill, foolishly setting forth in canoes in the hope of bagging some of the game with long-distance shots, yet getting nothing, to the merriment of all the others. And the boys and girls, stealing out in bright-colored bathing suits and silken beach robes to the water, there to plunge gaily in and shout and clatter concerning the joy of it all. And breakfast at 9, with afterwards the gaiety and beauty of the bright flotilla of canoes making eastward along the southern lake shore, banjos, guitars and mandolins strumming and voices raised in song, jest, laughter. Whatever matter with some sweet today? Face all dark. Can't 'em be happy out here with Sandra and all these nicey good baddies? And Clyde as instantly realizing that he must pretend to be gay and carefree. And then Harley, Bagot and Grant and Harriet at about noon announcing that there, just ahead, was the fine beach they had in mind, the Ramshorn, a spit of land commanding from its highest point all the length and breadth of the lake. And with room on the shore below for all the tents and paraphernalia of the company. And then, throughout this warm, pleasant Sunday afternoon, the usual program of activities, lunching, swimming, dancing, walking, card-playing, music. And Clyde and Sandra, like other couples, stealing off, Sandra with a mandolin, to a concealed rock far to the east of the camp, where in the shade of the pines they could lie, Sandra in Clyde's arms, and talk of the things they were certain to do later, even though, as she now announced, Mrs. Finchley was declaring that after this particular visit of Clyde's her daughter was to have nothing more to do with him in any such intimate social way as this particular trip gave opportunity for. He was too poor, too nondescript a relative of the Griffiths. It was so that Sandra, yet in a more veiled way, described her mother as talking, yet adding, "How ridiculous, sweetum. But don't you mind. I just laughed and agreed because I don't want to aggravate her just now. But I did ask her how I was to avoid meeting you here or anywhere now since you're as popular as you are. My sweetum is so good looking. Everybody thinks so, even the boys." At this very hour, on the veranda of the Silver Inn at Sharon, District Attorney Mason, with his assistant Burton Burla, Coroner Height, and Earl Newcomb, and the redoubtable Sheriff Slack, paunched and scowling, yet genial enough in ordinary social intercourse, together with 3 assistants, first, second and third deputies Kraut, Cecil and Swunk, conferring as to the best and most certain methods of immediate capture. "He has gone to Bear Lake. We must follow and trap him before news reaches him in any way that he is wanted." And so they set forth, this group, Burla and Earl Newcomb, about Sharon itself in order to gather such additional data as they might in connection with Clyde's arrival and departure from here for the Cranstons on Friday, talking with and subpoenaing any such individuals as might throw any light on his movements. Height to 3 Mile Bay on much the same errand, to see Captain Mooney of the Cygnus and the 3 men and Mason, together with the sheriff and his deputies, in a high-powered launch chartered for the occasion, to follow the now-known course of the only recently departed camping party, first to Little Fish Inlet and from there, in case the trail proved sound, to Bear Lake. And on Monday morning, while those at Ramshorn Point after breaking camp were already moving on towards Shelter Beach 14 miles east, Mason, together with Slack and his 3 deputies, arriving at the camp deserted the morning before. And there, the sheriff and Mason taking counsel with each other and then dividing their forces so that in canoes commandeered from lone residents of the region they now proceeded, Mason and 1st Deputy Kraut along the south shore, Slack and 2nd Deputy Cecil along the north shore, while young Swunk, blazing with a desire to arrest and handcuff someone, yet posing for the occasion as a lone young hunter or woodsman, paddled directly east along the center of the lake in search of any informing smoke or fires or tents or individuals idling along the shores. And with great dreams of being the one to capture the murderer, "I arrest you, Clyde Griffiths, in the name of the law!" Yet because of instructions from Mason, as well as Slack, grieving that instead, should he detect any signs, being the furthermost outpost, he must, in order to avoid frightening the prey or losing him, turn on his track and from some point not so likely to be heard by the criminal fire one single shot from his 8-chambered repeater, whereupon whichever party chanced to be nearest would fire 1 shot in reply and then proceed as swiftly as possible in his direction. But under no circumstances was he to attempt to take the criminal alone, unless noting the departure by boat or on foot of a suspicious person who answered the description of Clyde. At this very hour, Clyde, with Harley Baggett, Bertine, and Sandra, in one of the canoes, paddling eastward along with the remainder of the flotilla, looking back and wondering. Supposing by now, some officer or someone had arrived at Sharon and was following him up here? For would it be hard to find where he had gone, supposing only that they knew his name? But they did not know his name. Had not the items in the papers proved that? Why worry so always, especially on this utterly wonderful trip and when at last he and Sandra could be together again? And besides, was it not now possible for him to wander off by himself into these thinly populated woods along the shore to the eastward, toward that inn at the other end of the lake, and not return? Had he not inquired most casually on Saturday afternoon of Harley Baggett as well as others as to whether there was a road south or east from the east end of the lake? And had he not learned there was? And at last, at noon, Monday, reaching Shelter Beach, the third spot of beauty contemplated by the planners of this outing, where he helped to pitch the tents again while the girls played about. Yet at the same hour, at the Ramshorn site, because of the ashes from their fires left upon the shore, young Swunk, most eagerly and enthusiastically, like some seeking animal, approaching and examining the same and then going on, swiftly. And but 1 hour later, Mason and Kraut, reconnoitering the same spot, but without either devoting more than a cursory glance, since it was obvious that the prey had moved farther on. But then greater speed in paddling on the part of Swunk, until by 4 he arrived at Shelter Beach. And then, descrying as many as a half-dozen people in the water in the distance, at once turning and retreating in the direction of the others in order to give the necessary signal. And some 2 miles back firing one shot, which in its turn was responded to by Mason as well as Sheriff Slack. Both parties had heard and were now paddling swiftly east. At once Clyde in the water, near Sandra, hearing this was made to wonder. The ominous quality of that first shot. Followed by those 2 additional signals, farther away, yet seemingly in answer to the first. And then the ominous silence thereafter. What was that? And with Harley Baggett jesting, listen to the guys shooting game out of season, will you? It's against the law, isn't it? Hey, you! Grant Cranston shouted. Those are my ducks down there. Let 'em alone. If they can't shoot any better than you, Granty, they will let 'em alone. This from Berdine. Clyde, while attempting to smile, looked in the direction of the sound and listened like a hunted animal. What was it now that urged him to get out of the water and dress and run? Hurry! Hurry! To your tent! To the woods, quick! Until at last heeding this, and while most of the others were not looking, hurrying to his tent, changing to the one plain blue business suit and cap that he still possessed, then slipping into the woods back of the camp, out of sight and hearing of all present until he should be able to think and determine, but keeping always safely inland out of the direct view of the water, for fear, who could tell exactly what those shots meant? Yet Sandra. And her words of Saturday and yesterday and today. Could he leave her in this way, without being sure? Could he? Her kisses. Her dear assurances as to the future. What would she think now, and those others, in case he did not go back? The comment which was certain to be made in the Sharon and other papers in regard to this disappearance of his, and which was certain to identify him with this same Clifford Golden or Carl Graham. Was it not? Then reflecting also, the possible groundlessness of these fears, based on nothing more, maybe, than the chance shots of passing hunters on the lake or in these woods. And then pausing and debating with himself whether to go on or not. Yet, oh, the comfort of these tall, pillared trees, the softness and silence of these brown, carpeting needles on the ground, the clumps and thickets of underbrush under which one could lie and hide until night should fall again. And then on, and on. But turning, none the less, with the intention of returning to the camp to see whether anyone had come there. He might say he had taken a walk and got lost in the woods, but about this time, behind a protecting group of trees at least 2 miles west of the camp, a meeting and conference between Mason, Slack and all the others. And later, as a result of this and even as Clyde lingered and returned somewhat nearer the camp, Mason, Swunk paddling the canoe, arriving and inquiring of those who were now on shore if a Mr. Clyde Griffiths was present and might he see him. And Harley Baggett, being nearest, replying, "Why, yes, sure. He's around here somewhere." And Stuart Finchley calling, "A.O., Griffiths." But no reply. Yet Clyde, not near enough to hear any of this, even now returning toward the camp, very slowly and cautiously. And Mason concluding that possibly he was about somewhere and unaware of anything, of course, deciding to wait a few minutes anyhow, while advising Swunk to fall back into the woods and if by any chance encountering Slack or any other to advise him that one man be sent east along the bank and another west, while he, Swunk, proceeded in a boat eastward as before to the inn at the extreme end, in order that from there word might be given to all as to the presence of the suspect in this region. In the meanwhile Clyde by now only 3/4 of a mile east, and still whispered to by something which said, "Run, run, do not linger." Yet lingering, and thinking Sandra, this wonderful life. Should he go so? And saying to himself that he might be making a greater mistake by going than by staying. For supposing those shots were nothing, hunters, mere game shots meaning nothing in his case, and yet costing him all? And yet turning at last and saying to himself that perhaps it might be best not to return at present, anyhow at least not until very late, after dark, to see if those strange shots had meant anything. But then again pausing silently and dubiously, the while vesper sparrows and woodfinches sang. And peering. And peeking nervously. And then all at once, not more than 50 feet distant, out of the long, tall aisles of the trees before him, a whiskered, woodsman-like type of man approaching swiftly, yet silently, a tall, bony, sharp-eyed man in a brown felt hat and a brownish-gray baggy and faded suit that hung loosely over his spare body. And as suddenly calling as he came, which caused Clyde's blood to run cold with fear and rivet him to the spot. "Hold on a moment, mister. Don't move. Your name don't happen to be Clyde Griffiths, does it?" And Clyde, noting the sharp inquisitorial look in the eye of this stranger, as well as the fact that he had already drawn a revolver and was lifting it up, now pausing, the definiteness and authority of the man chilling him to the marrow. Was he really being captured? Had the officers of the law truly come for him? God! No hope of flight now. Why had he not gone on? Oh, why not? And at once he was weak and shaking, yet, not wishing to incriminate himself, about to reply, "No." Yet because of a more sensible thought, replying, "Why, yes, that's my name. You're with this camping party just west of here, aren't you?" "Yes, sir, I am." "All right, Mr. Griffiths. Excuse the revolver. I'm told to get you, whatever happens, that's all. My name is Kraut. Nicholas Kraut. I'm a deputy sheriff of Cataraqui County. And I have a warrant here for your arrest. I suppose you know what for, and that you're prepared to come with me peaceably." And at this Mr. Kraut gripped the heavy, dangerous-looking weapon more firmly even, and gazed at Clyde in a firm, conclusive way. Why, no, I don't," replied Clyde, weakly and heavily, his face white and thin. "But if you have a warrant for my arrest, I'll go with you, certainly." "But what, I don't understand," his voice began to tremble slightly as he said this, is why you want to arrest me. You don't, eh? You weren't up at either Big Bittern or Grass Lake by any chance on last Wednesday or Thursday, eh?" "Why, no, sir, I wasn't," replied Clyde, falsely. "And you don't happen to know anything about the drowning of a girl up there that you were supposed to be with, Roberta Walden, of Biltz, New York, I believe?" "Why, my God, no," replied Clyde, nervously and staccatically, the true name of Roberta and her address being used by this total stranger, and so soon, staggering him. Then they knew. They had obtained a clue. His true name and hers. God! Am I supposed to have committed a murder? He added, his voice faint, a mere whisper. Then you don't know that she was drowned last Thursday? And you weren't with her at that time? Mr. Kraut fixed a hard, inquisitive, unbelieving eye on him. "Why, no, of course, I wasn't," replied Clyde, recalling now but one thing, that he must deny all, until he should think or know what else to do or say. "And you didn't meet 3 men walking south last Thursday night from Big Bittern to 3 Mile Bay at about 11 o'clock? "Why, no, sir. Of course I didn't. I wasn't up there, I told you." "Very well, Mr. Griffiths, I haven't anything more to say. All I'm supposed to do is to arrest you, Clyde Griffiths, for the murder of Roberta Walden. You're my prisoner." He drew forth, more by way of a demonstration of force and authority than anything else, a pair of steel handcuffs, which caused Clyde to shrink and tremble as though he had been beaten. "You needn't put those on me, mister," he pleaded. "I wish you wouldn't. I never had anything like that on before. I'll go with you without them." He looked longingly and sadly about at the trees, into the sheltering depths of which so recently he ought to have plunged. To safety. Very well, then, replied the redoubtable Kraut. So long as you come along peaceful, and he took Clyde by one of his almost palsied arms. Do you mind if I ask you something else? Asked Clyde, weakly and fearsomely, as they now proceeded, the thought of Sandra and the others shimmering blindingly and reducingly before his eyes. Sandra. Sandra. To go back there an arrested murderer. And before her and Bertine. Oh, no. Are you intending to take me to that camp back there? Yes, sir, that's where I'm intending to take you now. Them's my orders. That's where the district attorney and the sheriff of Cataraqui County are just now. Oh, I know, pleaded Clyde, hysterically, for by now he had lost almost all poise. But couldn't you, so long as I go along just as you want, those are all my friends, you know, back there, and I'd hate. Couldn't you just take me around the camp somewhere to wherever you want to take me? I have a very special reason, that is, oh, God, I hope you won't take me back there right now, will you please, Mr. Kraut? He seemed to Kraut very boyish and weak now, clean of feature, rather innocent as to eye, well-dressed and well-mannered, not at all the savage and brutal or murderous type he had expected to find. Indeed quite up to the class whom he, Kraut, was inclined to respect. And might he not after all be a youth of very powerful connections? The conversations he had listened to thus far had indicated that this youth was certainly identified with one of the best families in Lycurgus. And in consequence he was now moved to a slight show of courtesy and so added, "Very well, young man, I don't want to be too hard on you. After all, I'm not the sheriff or the district attorney, just the arresting officer. There are others down there who are going to be able to say what to do about you, and when we get down to where they are, you can ask 'em, and it may be that they won't find it necessary to take you back in there. But how about your clothes? They're back there, ain't they?" "Oh, yes, but that doesn't matter," replied Clyde, nervously and eagerly. "I can get those any time. I just don't want to go back now, if I can help it." "All right, then, come along," replied Mr. Kraut. And so it was that they walked on together now in silence, the tall shafts of the trees in the approaching dusk making solemn aisles through which they proceeded as might worshippers along the nave of a cathedral, the eyes of Clyde contemplating nervously and wearily a smear of livid red still visible through the trees to the west. Charged with murder. Roberta dead. And Sandra dead, to him. And the Griffiths. And his uncle. And his mother. And all those people in that camp. Oh, God, why was it that he had not run, when that something, whatever it was, had so urged him? Chapter 9. In the absence of Clyde, the impressions taken by Mr. Mason of the world in which he moved here, complementing and confirming those of Lycurgus and Sharon, were sufficient to sober him in regard to the ease, possibly, with which previously he had imagined it might be possible to convict him. For about him was such a scene as suggested all the means as well as the impulse to quiet such a scandal as this. Wealth. Luxury. Important names and connections to protect no doubt. Was it not possible that the rich and powerful Griffiths, their nephew seized in this way and whatever his crime, would take steps to secure the best legal talent available, in order to protect their name? Unquestionably, and then with such adjournments as it was possible for such talent to secure, might it not be possible that long before he could hope to convict him, he himself would automatically be disposed of as a prosecutor and without being nominated for and elected to the judgeship he so craved and needed? Sitting before the circle of attractive tents that faced the lake and putting in order a fishing pole and reel, was Harley Bagot, in a brightly colored sweater and flannel trousers. And through the open flies of several tents, glimpses of individuals, Sandra, Bertine, Wynette and others, busy about toilets necessitated by the recent swim. Being dubious because of the smartness of the company as to whether it was politically or socially wise to proclaim openly the import of his errand, he chose to remain silent for a time, reflecting on the difference between the experiences of his early youth and that of Roberta Alden and these others. Naturally, as he saw it, a man of this Griffith's connections would seek to use a girl of Roberta's connections thus meanly and brutally and hope to get away with it. Yet, eager to make as much progress as he could against whatever inimical fates might now beset him, he finally approached Bagot, and most acidly, yet with as much show of genial and appreciative sociability as he could muster, observed, "A delightful place for a camp, eh?" "Yea, we think so. Just a group from the estates and hotels about Sharon, I suppose?" "Yea. The south and west shore principally. Not any of the Griffiths, other than Mr. Clyde, I presume?" "No, they're still over at Greenwood, I think. You know Mr. Clyde Griffiths personally, I suppose?" "Oh, sure, he's one of the party. You don't happen to know how long he's been up here this time, I presume, up with the Cranstons, I mean?" "Since Friday, I think. I saw him Friday morning, anyhow. But he'll be back here soon and you can ask him yourself," concluded Bagot, beginning to sense that Mr. Mason was a little too inquisitive and in addition not of either his or Clyde's world. And just then, Frank Harriet, with a tennis racket under his arm, striding across the foreground. "Where to, Frankie?" "To try those courts Harrison laid out up here this morning." "Who with?" "Violet, Nadine, and Stuart." "Any room for another court?" "Sure, there's two. Why not get Bert, and Clyde, and Sandra, and come up?" "Well, maybe, after I get this thing set." And Mason at once thinking, Clyde and Sandra. Clyde Griffiths and Sandra Finchley, the very girl whose notes and cards were in one of his pockets now. And might he not see her here, along with Clyde, possibly later talk to her about him? But just then, Sandra and Bertine and Wynette coming out of their respective tents. And Bertine calling, "Oh, say, Harley, seen Nadine anywhere?" "No, but Frank just went by. He said he was going up to the courts to play with her and Violet and Stu." "Yes? Well, then, come on, Sandra. You too, Wynette. We'll see how it looks." Bertine, as she pronounced Sandra's name, turned to take her arm, which gave Mason the exact information and opportunity he desired, that of seeing and studying for a moment the girl who had so tragically and no doubt all unwittingly replaced Roberta in Clyde's affections. And, as he could see for himself, more beautiful, more richly apparelled than ever the other could have hoped to be. And alive, as opposed to the other now dead and in a morgue in Bridgeburg. But even as he gazed, the three tripping off together arm in arm, Sandra calling back to Harley, "If you see Clyde, tell him to come on up, will you?" And he replying, "Do you think that shadow of yours needs to be told?" Mason, impressed by the color and the drama, looked intently and even excitedly about. Now it was all so plain why he wanted to get rid of the girl, the true, underlying motive. That beautiful girl there, as well as this luxury to which he aspired. And to think that a young man of his years and opportunities would stoop to such a horrible trick as that. Unbelievable. And only 4 days after the murder of the other poor girl, playing about with this beautiful girl in this fashion, and hoping to marry her, as Roberta had hoped to marry him. The unbelievable villainies of life. Now, half determining since Clyde did not appear, that he would proclaim himself and proceed to search for and seize his belongings here, Ed Swankry appearing and with a motion of the head indicating that Mason was to follow him. And once well within the shadow of the surrounding trees, indicating no less an individual than Nicholas Kraut, attended by a slim, neatly dressed youth of about Clyde's reported years, who, on the instant and because of the waxy paleness of his face, he assumed must be Clyde. And at once he now approached him, as might an angry wasp or hornet, only pausing first to ask of Swank where he had been captured and by whom, then gazing at Clyde critically and austerely as befitted one who represented the power and majesty of the law. "So you are Clyde Griffiths, are you?" "Yes, sir." "Well, Mr. Griffiths, my name is Orville Mason. I am the district attorney of the county in which Big Bittern and Grass Lake are situated." I suppose you are familiar enough with those two places by now, aren't you? He paused to see the effect of this sardonic bit of commentary. Yet although he expected to see him wince and quail, Clyde merely gazed at him, his nervous, dark eyes showing enormous strain. "No, sir, I can't say that I am." For with each step through the woods thus far back, there had been growing within him the utter and unshakable conviction that in the face of whatever seeming proof or charges might now appear, he dared not tell anything in regard to himself, his connection with Roberta, his visit to Big Bittern or Grass Lake. He dared not. For that would be the same as a confession of guilt in connection with something of which he was not really guilty. And no one must believe, never, Sandra, or the Griffiths, or any of these fine friends of his, that he could ever have been guilty of such a thought, even. And yet here they were, all within call, and at any moment might approach and so learn the meaning of his arrest. And while he felt the necessity for so denying any knowledge in connection with all this, at the same time he stood in absolute terror of this man, the opposition and irritated mood such an attitude might arouse in him. That broken nose. His large, stern eyes. And then Mason, eyeing him as one might an unheard of and yet desperate animal, and irritated also by his denial, yet assuming from his blanched expression that he might and no doubt would shortly be compelled to confess his guilt, continuing with, "You know what you are charged with, Mr. Griffiths, of course." "Yes, sir, I just heard it from this man here." "And you admit it?" "Why, no sir, of course I don't admit it," replied Clyde, his thin and now white lips drawn tight over his even teeth, his eyes full of a deep, tremulous yet evasive terror. "Why, what nonsense! What effrontery! You deny being up to Grass Lake and Big Bittern on last Wednesday and Thursday?" "Yes, sir." "Well, then," and now Mason stiffened himself in an angry and at the same time inquisitorial way, "I suppose you are going to deny knowing Roberta Alden, the girl you took to Grass Lake, and then out on Big Bittern in that boat last Thursday, the girl you knew in Lycurgus all last year, who lived at Mrs. Gilpin's and worked under you in your department at Griffiths and Company, the girl to whom you gave that toilet set last Christmas. I suppose you're going to say that your name isn't Clyde Griffiths and that you haven't been living with Mrs. Peyton in Taylor Street, and that these aren't letters and cards from your trunk there, from Roberta Alden and from Miss Finchley, all these cards and notes." And extracting the letters and cards as he spoke and waving them before Clyde. And at each point in this harangue, thrusting his broad face, with its flat, broken nose and somewhat aggressive chin directly before Clyde's, and blazing at him with sultry, contemptuous eyes, while the latter leaned away from him, wincing almost perceptibly and with icy chills running up and down his spine and affecting his heart and brain. Those letters. All this information concerning him. And back in his bag in the tent there, all those more recent letters of Sandra's in which she dwelt on how they were to elope together this coming fall. If only he had destroyed them. And now this man might find those, would, and question Sandra maybe, and all these others. He shrunk and congealed spiritually, the revealing effects of his so poorly conceived and executed scheme weighing upon him as the world upon the shoulders of an inadequate Atlas. And yet, feeling that he must say something and yet not admit anything. And finally replying, "My name's Clyde Griffiths all right, but the rest of this isn't true. I don't know anything about the rest of it." "Oh, come now, Mr. Griffiths. Don't begin by trying to play fast and loose with me. We won't get anywhere that way. You won't help yourself one bit by that with me, and besides I haven't any time for that now. Remember these men here are witnesses to what you say. I've just come from Lycurgus, your room at Mrs. Peyton's, and I have in my possession your trunk and this Miss Alden's letters to you. Indisputable proof that you did know this girl, that you courted and seduced her last winter, and that since then, this spring, when she became pregnant on your account, you induced her first to go home and then later to go away with you on this trip in order, as you told her, to marry her. Well, you married her all right, to the grave, that's how you married her, to the water at the bottom of Big Bittern Lake. And you can actually stand here before me now, when I tell you that I have all the evidence I need right on my person, and say that you don't even know her. Well, I'll be damned." And as he spoke his voice grew so loud that Clyde feared that it could be clearly heard in the camp beyond. And that Sandra herself might hear it and come over. And although at the outrush and jab and slash of such dooming facts as Mason so rapidly outlined, his throat tightened and his hands were with difficulty restrained from closing and clenching vice-wise, at the conclusion of it all he merely replied, "Yes, sir." "Well, I'll be damned," reiterated Mason. "I can well believe now that you would kill a girl and sneak away in just such a way as you did, and with her in that condition. But then to try to deny her own letters to you. Why, you might as well try to deny that you're here and alive. These cards and notes here, what about them? I suppose they're not from Miss Finchley? How about those? Do you mean to tell me these are not from her either?" He waved them before Clyde's eyes. And Clyde, seeing that the truth concerning these, Sandra being within call, was capable of being substantiated here and now, replied, "No, I don't deny that those are from her." "Very good. But these others from your trunk in the same room are not from Miss Alden to you?" "I don't care to say as to that," he replied, blinking feebly as Mason waved Roberta's letters before him. "TST. TST. TST. Of all things," clicked Mason in high dudgeon. "Such nonsense. Such effrontery. Oh, very well, we won't worry about all that now. I can easily prove it all when the time comes. But how you can stand there and deny it, knowing that I have the evidence, is beyond me. A card in your own handwriting which you forgot to take out of the bag you had her leave at Gun Lodge while you took yours with you. Mr. Carl Graham, Mr. Clifford Golden, Mr. Clyde Griffiths, a card on which you wrote from Clyde to Bert, 'Merry Christmas.' Do you remember that? Well, here it is." And here he reached into his pocket and drew forth the small card taken from the toilet set and waved it under Clyde's nose. "Have you forgotten that, too? Your own handwriting?" And then pausing and getting no reply, finally adding, "Why, what a dunce you are, what a poor plotter, without even the brains not to use your own initials in getting up those fake names you had hoped to masquerade under, Mr. Carl Graham, Mr. Clifford Golden." At the same time, fully realizing the importance of a confession and wondering how it was to be brought about here and now, Mason suddenly, Clyde's expression, his frozen-faced terror, suggesting the thought that perhaps he was too frightened to talk at once, changed his tactics, at least to the extent of lowering his voice, smoothing the formidable wrinkles from his forehead and about his mouth. "You see, it's this way, Griffiths," he now began, much more calmly and simply. "Lying or just foolish thoughtless denial under such circumstances as these can't help you in the least. It can only harm you, and that's the truth. You may think I've been a little rough so far, but it was only because I've been under a great strain myself in connection with this case, trying to catch up with someone I thought would be a very different type from yourself. But now that I see you and see how you feel about it all, how really frightened you are by what has happened, it just occurs to me that there may be something in connection with this case, some extenuating circumstances, which, if they were related by you now, might throw a slightly different light on all this. Of course, I don't know. You yourself ought to be the best judge, but I'm laying the thought before you for what it's worth. For, of course, here are these letters. Besides, when we get to 3 Mile Bay tomorrow, as we will, I hope, there will be those 3 men who met you the other night walking south from Big Bittern. And not only those, but the innkeeper from Grass Lake, the innkeeper from Big Bittern, the boatkeeper up there who rented that boat, and the driver who drove you and Roberta Alden over from Gun Lodge. They will identify you. Do you think they won't know you? Not any of them, not be able to say whether you were up there with her or not, or that a jury when the time comes won't believe them. And all this Clyde registered mentally like a machine clicking to a coin, yet said nothing, merely staring, frozen. And not only that, went on Mason, very softly and most ingratiatingly, but there's Mrs. Peyton, She saw me take these letters and cards out of that trunk of yours in your room and from the top drawer of your chiffonier. Next, there are all those girls in that factory where you and Miss Alden worked. Do you suppose they're not going to remember all about you and her when they learn that she is dead? Oh, what nonsense. You ought to be able to see that for yourself, whatever you think. You certainly can't expect to get away with that. It makes a sort of a fool out of you. You can see that for yourself." He paused again, hoping for a confession. But Clyde, still convinced that any admission in connection with Roberta or Big Bittern spelled ruin, merely stared while Mason proceeded to add, "All right, Griffiths, I'm now going to tell you one more thing, and I couldn't give you better advice if you were my own son or brother and I were trying to get you out of this instead of merely trying to get you to tell the truth. If you hope to do anything at all for yourself now, it's not going to help you to deny everything in the way you are doing. You are simply making trouble and condemning yourself in other people's eyes. Why not say that you did know her and that you were up there with her and that she wrote you those letters, and be done with it? You can't get out of that, whatever else you may hope to get out of. Any sane person, your own mother, if she were here, would tell you the same thing. It's too ridiculous and indicates guilt rather than innocence. Why not come clean here and now as to those facts, anyhow, before it's too late to take advantage of any mitigating circumstances in connection with all this, if there are any? And if you do now, and I can help you in any way, I promise you here and now that I'll be only too glad to do so. For, after all, I'm not out here just to hound a man to death or make him confess to something that he hasn't done, but merely to get at the truth in the case. But if you're going to deny that you even knew this girl when I tell you I have all the evidence and can prove it, why then," and here the district attorney lifted his hands aloft most wearily and disgustedly. But now as before Clyde remained silent and pale. In spite of all Mason had revealed, and all that this seemingly friendly, intimate advice seemed to imply, still he could not conceive that it would be anything less than disastrous for him to admit that he even knew Roberta. The fatality of such a confession in the eyes of these others here. The conclusion of all his dreams in connection with Sandra and this life. And so, in the face of this, silence, still. And at this, Mason, irritated beyond measure, finally exclaiming, "Oh, very well, then. So you've finally decided not to talk, have you?" And Clyde, blue and weak, replied, "I had nothing to do with her death. That's all I can say now," and yet even as he said it thinking that perhaps he had better not say that perhaps he had better say, well, what? That he knew Roberta, of course, had been up there with her, for that matter, but that he had never intended to kill her, that her drowning was an accident. For he had not struck her at all, except by accident, had he? Only it was best not to confess to having struck her at all, wasn't it? For who under such circumstances would believe that he had struck her with a camera by accident? Best not to mention the camera, since there was no mention anywhere in the papers that he had had one with him. And he was still cogitating while Mason was exclaiming, "Then you admit that you knew her?" "No, sir." "Very well, then," he now added, turning to the others, "I suppose there's nothing for it but to take him back there and see what they know about him. Perhaps that will get something out of this fine bird, to confront him with his friends. His bag and things are still back there in one of those tents, I believe. Suppose we take him down there, gentlemen, and see what these other people know about him." And now, swiftly and coldly he turned, while Clyde, already shrinking at the horror of what was coming, exclaimed, "Oh, please, no. You don't mean to do that, do you? Oh, you won't do that? Oh, please, no." And at this point Kraut speaking up and saying, "He asked me back there in the woods if I wouldn't ask you not to take him in there." "Oh, so that's the way the wind blows, is it?" exclaimed Mason at this. Too thin-skinned to be shown up before ladies and gentlemen of the 12th Lake Colony, but not even willing to admit that you knew the poor little working girl who worked for you. Very good. Well, then, my fine friend, suppose you come through with what you really do know now, or down there you go. and he paused a moment to see what effect that would have. "We'll call all those people together and explain just how things are, and then see if you will be willing to stand there and deny everything." But noting still a touch of hesitation in Clyde, he now added, "Bring him along, boys." And turning toward the camp, he proceeded to walk in that direction a few paces while Kraut taking one arm, and Swank another, and beginning to move Clyde, he ended by exclaiming, "Oh, please, no. Oh, I hope you won't do anything like that, will you, Mr. Mason? Oh, I don't want to go back there if you don't mind. It isn't that I'm guilty, but you can get all my things without my going back there. And besides, it will mean so much to me just now." Beads of perspiration once more burst forth on his pale face and hands, and he was deadly cold. "Don't want to go, eh?" exclaimed Mason, pausing as he heard this. "It would hurt your pride, would it, to have him know? Well, then, supposing you just answer some of the things I want to know, and come clean and quick, or off we go, and that without one more moment's delay. Now, will you answer or won't you?" And again he turned to confront Clyde, who, with lips trembling and eyes confused and wavering, nervously and emphatically announced, "Of course I knew her. Of course I did. Sure. Those letters show that. But what of it? I didn't kill her. And I didn't go up there with her with any intention of killing her, either. I didn't. I tell you. It was all an accident. I didn't even want to take her up there. She wanted me to go away with her somewhere, because, well, you know, her letters show. And I was only trying to get her to go off somewhere by herself, so she would let me alone, because I didn't want to marry her. That's all. And I took her out there, not to kill her at all, but to try to persuade her, that's all. And I didn't upset the boat, at least, I didn't mean to. The wind blew my hat off, and she and I, got up at the same time to reach for it, and the boat upset, that's all. And the side of it hit her on the head. I saw it, only I was too frightened the way she was struggling about in the water to go near her, because I was afraid that if I did she might drag me down. And then she went down. And I swam ashore. And that's the God's truth." His face, as he talked, had suddenly become all flushed, and his hands also. Yet his eyes were tortured, terrified pools of misery. He was thinking, but maybe there wasn't any wind that afternoon, and maybe they would find that out. Or the tripod hidden under a log. If they found that, wouldn't they think he hit her with that? He was wet and trembling. But already Mason was beginning to question him again. "Now, let's see as to this a minute. You say you didn't take her up there with any intention of killing her?" "No, sir, I didn't." "Well, then, how was it that you decided to write your name 2 different ways on those registers up there at Big Bittern and Grass Lake?" "Because I didn't want anyone to know that I was up there with her." "Oh, I see. Didn't want any scandal in connection with the condition she was in?" "No, sir." "Yes, sir, that is. But you didn't mind if her name was scandalized in case she was found afterwards?" "But I didn't know she was going to be drowned," replied Clyde, slyly and shrewdly, sensing the trap in time. "But you did know that you yourself weren't coming back, of course. You knew that, didn't you?" "Why, no, sir, I didn't know that I wasn't coming back. I thought I was." Pretty clever, thought Mason to himself, but not saying so, and then, rapidly, "And so in order to make everything easy and natural as possible for you to come back, you took your own bag with you and left hers up there. Is that the way? How about that? But I didn't take it because I was going away. We decided to put our lunch in it." "We, or you?" "We. And so you had to carry that big bag in order to take a little lunch along, eh? Couldn't you have taken it in a paper, or in her bag?" "Well, her bag was full, and I didn't like to carry anything in a paper." "Oh, I see. Too proud and sensitive, eh? But not too proud to carry a heavy bag all the way, say 12 miles, in the night to 3 Mile Bay, and not ashamed to be seen doing it, either, were you? Well, after she was drowned, and I didn't want to be known as having been up there with her, and had to go along." He paused while Mason merely looked at him, thinking of the many, many questions he wanted to ask him, so many, many more, and which, as he knew or guessed, would be impossible for him to explain. Yet it was getting late, and back in the camp were Clyde's as yet unclaimed belongings, his bag and possibly that suit he had worn that day at Big Bittern, a gray one as he had heard, not this one. And to catechize him here this way in the dusk, while it might be productive of much if only he could continue it long enough, still there was the trip back, and en route he would have ample time to continue his questionings. And so, although he disliked much so to do at the moment, he now concluded with, "Oh, well, I tell you, Griffiths, we'll let you rest here for the present. It may be that what you are saying is so, I don't know. I most certainly hope it is, for your sake. At any rate, you go along there with Mr. Kraut. He'll show you where to go." And then turning to Swink and Kraut, he exclaimed, "All right, boys. I'll tell you how we'll do. It's getting late and we'll have to hurry a little if we expect to get anywhere yet tonight. Mr. Kraut, suppose you take this young man down where those other 2 boats are and wait there. Just halloo a little as you go along to notify the sheriff and Cecil that we're ready. And then Swink and I'll be along in the other boat as soon as we can." And so saying and Kraut obeying, he and Swink proceeded inward through the gathering dusk to the camp, while Kraut with Clyde went west, hallooing for the sheriff and his deputy until a response was had. Chapter 10. The effect of Mason's reappearance in the camp with the news, announced first to Frank Harriet, next to Harley Baggett and Grant Cranston, that Clyde was under arrest, that he actually had confessed to having been with Roberta at Big Bittern, if not to having killed her, and that he, Mason, was there with Swink to take possession of his property, was sufficient to destroy this pretty outing as by a breath. For although amazement and disbelief and astounded confusion were characteristic of the words of all, nevertheless here was Mason demanding to know where were Clyde's things, and asserting that it was at Clyde's request only that he was not brought here to identify his own possessions. Frank Harriet, the most practical of the group, sensing the truth and authority of this, at once led the way to Clyde's tent, where Mason began an examination of the contents of the bag and clothes, while Grant Cranston, as well as Baggett, aware of Sandra's intense interest in Clyde, departed first to call Stuart, then Bertine, and finally Sandra, moving apart from the rest the more secretly to inform her as to what was then occurring. And she, following the first clear understanding as to this, turning white and fainting at the news, falling back in Grant's arms and being carried to her tent, where, after being restored to consciousness, she exclaimed, "I don't believe a word of it. It's not true. Why, it couldn't be. That poor boy. Oh, Clyde. Where is he? Where have they taken him?" But Stuart and Grant, by no means as emotionally moved as herself, cautioning her to be silent. It might be true at that. Supposing it were? The others would hear, wouldn't they? And supposing it weren't, he could soon prove his innocence and be released, couldn't he? There was no use in carrying on like this now. But then, Sandra in her thoughts going over the bare possibility of such a thing, a girl killed by Clyde at Big Bittern, himself arrested and being taken off in this way, and she thus publicly, or at least by this group, known to be so interested in him, her parents to know, the public itself to know, maybe, but Clyde must be innocent. It must be all a mistake. And then her mind turning back and thinking of that news of the drowned girl she had first heard over the telephone there at the Harriets. And then Clyde's whiteness, his illness, his all but complete collapse. Oh, no exclamation mark, not that. Yet his delay in coming from Lycurgus until the Friday before. His failure to write from there. And then, the full horror of the charge returning, as suddenly collapsing again, lying perfectly still and white while Grant and the others agreed among themselves that the best thing to be done was to break up the camp, either now or early in the morning, and depart for Sharon. And Sandra returning to consciousness after a time tearfully announcing that she must get out of here at once, that she couldn't endure this place, and begging Bertie and all the others to stay close to her and say nothing about her having fainted and cried, since it would only create talk. And thinking all the time of how, if this were all true, she could secure those letters she had written him. Oh, heavens! For supposing now at this time they should fall into the hands of the police or the newspapers, and be published. And yet moved by her love for him and for the first time in her young life shaken to the point where the grim and stern realities of life were thrust upon her gay and vain notice. And so it was immediately arranged that she leave with Stuart, Bertie and Grant for the Matisik Inn at the eastern end of the lake, since from there, at dawn, according to Bagot, they might leave for Albany, and so, in a roundabout way for Sharon. In the meantime, Mason, after obtaining possession of all Clyde's belongings here, quickly making his way west to Little Fish Inlet and 3 Mile Bay, stopping only for the first night at a farmhouse and arriving at 3 Mile Bay late on Tuesday night. Yet not without, en route, catechizing Clyde as he had planned, the more particularly since in going through his effects in the tent at the camp he had not found the grey suit said to have been worn by Clyde at Big Bittern. And Clyde, troubled by this new development, denying that he had worn a grey suit and insisting that the suit he had on was the one he had worn. But wasn't it thoroughly soaked? Yes. Well, then, where was it cleaned and pressed afterward? In Sharon. In Sharon? Yes, sir. By a tailor there? Yes, sir. What tailor? Alas, Clyde could not remember. Then you wore it crumpled and wet, did you, from Big Bittern to Sharon? Yes, sir. And no one noticed it, of course. Not that I remember, no. Not that you remember, eh? Well, we'll see about that later, and deciding that unquestionably Clyde was a plotter and a murderer. Also that eventually he could make Clyde show where he had hidden the suit or had had it cleaned. Next there was the straw hat found on the lake. What about that? By admitting that the wind had blown his hat off, Clyde had intimated that he had worn a hat on the lake, but not necessarily the straw hat found on the water. But now Mason was intent on establishing within hearing of these witnesses, the ownership of the hat found on the water as well as the existence of a second hat worn later. That straw hat of yours that you say the wind blew in the water? You didn't try to get that either at the time, did you? No, sir. Didn't think of it, I suppose, in the excitement? No, sir. But just the same, you had another straw hat when you went down through the woods there. Where did you get that one? And Clyde, trapped and puzzled by this pausing for the fraction of a second, frightened and wondering whether or not it could be proved that this second straw hat he was wearing was the one he had worn through the woods. Also whether the one on the water had been purchased in Utica, as it had. And then deciding to lie. But I didn't have another straw hat. Without paying any attention to that, Mason reached over and took the straw hat on Clyde's head and proceeded to examine the lining with its imprint, Stark and Company, Lycurgus. This one has a lining, I see. Bought this in Lycurgus, eh? Yes, sir. When? Oh, back in June. But still you're sure now it's not the one you wore down through the woods that night? No, sir. Well, where was it then? And Clyde once more pausing like one in a trap and thinking, my God. How am I to explain this now? Why did I admit that the one on the lake was mine? Yet, as instantly recalling that whether he had denied it or not, there were those at Grass Lake and Big Bittern who would remember that he had worn a straw hat on the lake, of course. Where was it then? Insisted Mason. And Clyde at last saying, oh, I was up here once before and wore it then. I forgot it when I went down the last time but I found it again the other day. Oh, I see. Very convenient, I must say. He was beginning to believe that he had a very slippery person to deal with indeed, that he must think of his traps more shrewdly, and at the same time determining to summon the Cranstons and every member of the Bear Lake party in order to discover whether any recalled Clyde not wearing a straw hat on his arrival this time. Also whether he had left a straw hat the time before. He was lying, of course, and he would catch him. And so no real peace for Clyde at any time between there and Bridgeburg and the county jail. For however much he might refuse to answer, still Mason was forever jumping at him with such questions as, why was it if all you wanted to do was to eat lunch on shore that you had to row all the way down to that extreme south end of the lake when it isn't nearly so attractive there as it is at other points? And, where was it that you spent the rest of that afternoon? Surely not just there. And then, jumping back to Sandra's letters discovered in his bag. How long had he known her? Was he as much in love with her as she appeared to be with him? Wasn't it because of her promise to marry him in the fall that he had decided to kill Miss Alden? But while Clyde vehemently troubled to deny this last charge, still for the most part he gazed silently and miserably before him with his tortured and miserable eyes. And then a most wretched night spent in the garret of a farmhouse at the west end of the lake, and on a pallet on the floor, while Cecil, Swank, and Kraut, gun in hand, in turn kept watch over him, and Mason and the sheriff and the others slept below stairs. And some natives, because of information distributed somehow, coming toward morning to inquire, we hear the feller that killed the girl over to Big Bittern is here, is that right? And then waiting to see them off at dawn in the ford secured by Mason. And again at Little Fish Inlet as well as 3 Mile Bay, actual crowds, farmers, storekeepers, summer residents, woodsmen, children, all gathered because of word telephoned on ahead apparently. And at the latter place, Burla, Height, and Newcomb, who, because of previously telephoned information, had brought before one Gabriel Gregg, a most lanky and crusty and meticulous justice of the peace, all of the individuals from Big Bittern necessary to identify him fully. And now Mason, before this local justice, charging Clyde with the death of Roberta and having him properly and legally held as a material witness to be lodged in the county jail at Bridgeburg. And then taking him, along with Burton, the sheriff and his deputies, to Bridgeburg, where he was promptly locked up. And once there, Clyde throwing himself on the iron cot and holding his head in a kind of agony of despair. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, and just outside the jail as they approached he had seen a crowd of at least 500, noisy, jeering, threatening. For had not the news been forwarded that because of his desire to marry a rich girl he had most brutally assaulted and murdered a young and charming working girl whose only fault had been that she loved him too well? There had been hard and threatening cries of "There he is, the dirty bastard! You'll swing for this yet, you young devil, wait and see." This from a young woodsman not unlike Swank in type, a hard, destroying look in his fierce young eyes, leaning out from the crowd. And worse, a waspish type of small-town slum girl, dressed in a gingham dress, who in the dim light of the arcs, had leaned forward to cry, "Look at, the dirty little sneak, the murderer! You thought you'd get away with it, didn't ya?" And Clyde, crowding closer to Sheriff Slack, and thinking, "Why, they actually think I did kill her. And they may even lynch me." But so weary and confused and debased and miserable that at the sight of the outer steel jail door swinging open to receive him, he actually gave vent to a sigh of relief because of the protection it afforded. But once in his cell, suffering none the less without cessation the long night through, from thoughts concerning all that had just gone. Sandra. The Griffiths. Burdine. All those people in Lycurgus when they should hear in the morning. His mother eventually, everybody. Where was Sandra now? For Mason had told her, of course, and all those others, when he had gone back to secure his things. And they knew him now for what he was, a plotter of murder. Only, if somebody could only know how it had all come about. If Sandra, his mother, anyone, could truly see. Perhaps if he were to explain all to this man Mason now, before it all went any further, exactly how it all had happened. But that meant a true explanation as to his plot, his real original intent, that camera, his swimming away. That unintended blow, and who was going to believe him as to that his hiding the tripod afterwards. Besides, once all that was known, would he not be done for just the same in connection with Sandra, the Griffiths, everybody? And very likely prosecuted and executed for murder just the same. Oh, heavens, murder! And to be tried for that now, this terrible crime against her proved. They would electrocute him just the same, wouldn't they? And then the full horror of that coming upon him, death, possibly, and for murder, he sat there quite still. Death. God. If only he had not left those letters written him by Roberta and his mother in his room there at Mrs. Peyton's. If only he had removed his trunk to another room, say, before he left. Why hadn't he thought of that? Yet as instantly thinking, might not that have been a mistake, too, being seemingly a suspicious thing to have done then? But how came they to know where he was from and what his name was? Then, as instantly returning in mind to the letters in the trunk. For, as he now recalled, in one of those letters from his mother she had mentioned that affair in Kansas City, and Mason would come to know of that. If only he had destroyed them. Roberta's, his mother's, all. Why hadn't he? But not being able to answer why, just an insane desire to keep things maybe, anything that related to him, a kindness, a tenderness toward him. If only he had not worn that second straw hat, had not met those three men in the woods. God. He might have known they would be able to trace him in some way. If only he had gone on in that wood at Bear Lake, taking his suitcase and Sandra's letters with him. Perhaps, who knows, in Boston, or New York, or somewhere he might have hidden away. Unstrung and agonized, he was unable to sleep at all, but walked back and forth, or sat on the side of the hard and strange cot, thinking. And at dawn, a bony, aged, roomy jailer, in a baggy, worn, blue uniform, bearing a black, iron tray, on which was a tinful of coffee, some bread and a piece of ham with one egg. And looking curiously and yet somehow indifferently at Clyde, while he forced it through an aperture only wide and high enough for its admission, though Clyde wanted nothing at all. And then later Kraut and Sissel and Swunk, and eventually the sheriff himself, each coming separately, to look in and say, "Well, Griffiths, how are you this morning?" Or, "Hello, anything we can do for you?" While their eyes showed the astonishment, disgust, suspicion or horror with which his assumed crime had filled them. Yet, even in the face of that, having one type of interest and even sycophantic pride in his presence here. For was he not a Griffiths, a member of the well-known social group of the big central cities to the south of here? Also the same to them, as well as to the enormously fascinated public outside, as a trapped and captured animal, taken in their legal net by their own superlative skill and now held as witness to it? And with the newspapers and people certain to talk, enormous publicity for them, their pictures in the papers as well as his, their names persistently linked with his. And Clyde, looking at them between the bars, attempted to be civil, since he was now in their hands and they could do with him as they would. Chapter 11. In connection with the autopsy and its results there was a decided setback. For while the joint report of the 5 doctors showed an injury to the mouth and nose, the tip of the nose appears to have been slightly flattened, the lips swollen, one front tooth slightly loosened, and an abrasion of the mucous membrane within the lips, all agreed that these injuries were by no means fatal. The chief injury was to the skull, the very thing which Clyde in his first confession had maintained, which appeared to have been severely bruised by a blow of some sharp instrument, unfortunately in this instance, because of the heaviness of the blow of the boat, signs of fracture and internal hemorrhage which might have produced death. But, the lungs when placed in water, sinking, an absolute proof that Roberta could not have been dead when thrown into the water, but alive and drowning, as Clyde had maintained. And no other signs of violence or struggle, although her arms and fingers appeared to be set in such a way as to indicate that she might have been reaching or seeking to grasp something. The wail of the boat? Could that be? Might Clyde's story, after all, conceal a trace of truth? Certainly these circumstances seemed to favor him a little. Yet as Mason and the others agreed, all these circumstances most distinctly seemed to prove that although he might not have slain her outright before throwing her into the water, nonetheless he had struck her and then had thrown her, perhaps unconscious, into the water. But with what? If he could but make Clyde say that. And then an inspiration. He would take Clyde and, although the law specifically guaranteed accused persons against compulsions, compel him to retrace the scenes of his crime. And although he might not be able to make him commit himself in any way, still, once on the ground and facing the exact scene of his crime, his actions might reveal something of the whereabouts of the suit, perhaps, or possibly some instrument with which he had struck her. And in consequence, on the third day following Clyde's incarceration, a second visit to Big Bittern, with Kraut, Haight, Mason, Burton, Burla, Earl Newcomb and Sheriff Slack as his companions, and a slow recanvassing of all the ground he had first traveled on that dreadful day. And with Kraut, following instructions from Mason, playing up to him, in order to ingratiate himself into his good graces, and possibly cause him to make a clean breast of it. For Kraut was to argue that the evidence, so far, was so convincing that you never would get a jury to believe that you didn't do it, but that, if you would talk right out to Mason, he could do more for you with the judge and the governor than anyone could, get you off, maybe, with life or 20 years, while this way you're likely to get the chair, sure. Yet Clyde, because of that same fear that had guided him at Bear Lake, maintaining a profound silence. For why should he say that he had struck her, when he had not, intentionally at least? Or with what, since no thought of the camera had come up as yet? At the lake, after definite measurements by the county surveyor as to the distance from the spot where Roberta had drowned to the spot where Clyde had landed, Earl Newcomb suddenly returning to Mason with an important discovery. For under a log not so far from the spot at which Clyde had stood to remove his wet clothes, the tripod he had hidden, a little rusty and damp, but of sufficient weight, as Mason and all these others were now ready to believe, to have delivered the blow upon Roberta's skull which had felled her and so make it possible for him to carry her to the boat and later drown her. Yet, confronted with this and turning paler than before, Clyde denying that he had a camera or a tripod with him, although Mason was instantly deciding that he would re-question all witnesses to find out whether any recalled seeing a tripod or camera in Clyde's possession. And before the close of this same day learning from the guide who had driven Clyde and Roberta over, as well as the boatman who had seen Clyde drop his bag into the boat, and a young waitress at Grass Lake who had seen Clyde and Roberta going out from the inn to the station on the morning of their departure from Grass Lake, that all now recalled a yellow bundle of sticks, fastened to his bag which must have been the very tripod. And then Burton Burla deciding that it might not really have been the tripod, after all, with which he had struck her, but possibly and even probably the somewhat heavier body of the camera itself, since an edge of it would explain the wound on the top of the head and the flat surface would explain the general wounds on her face. And because of this conclusion, without any knowledge on the part of Clyde, however, Mason securing divers from among the woodsmen of the region and setting them to diving in the immediate vicinity of the spot where Roberta's body had been found, with the result that after an entire day's diving on the part of 6, and because of a promised and substantial reward, one Jack Bogart arose with the very camera which Clyde, as the boat had turned over, had let fall. Worse, after examination it proved to contain a roll of films, which upon being submitted to an expert chemist for development, showed finally to be a series of pictures of Roberta, made on shore, one sitting on a log, a second posed by the side of the boat on shore, a third reaching up toward the branches of a tree, all very dim and water-soaked but still decipherable, and the exact measurements of the broadest side of the camera corresponding in a general way to the length and breadth of the wounds upon Roberta's face, which caused it now to seem positive that they had discovered the implement wherewith Clyde had delivered the blows. Yet no trace of blood upon the camera itself, and none upon the side or bottom of the boat, which had been brought to Bridgeburg for examination. And none upon the rug which had lain in the bottom of the boat. In Burton Burla there existed as sly a person as might have been found in a score of such backwoods counties as this, and soon he found himself meditating on how easy it would be, supposing irrefragable evidence were necessary, for him or anyone to cut a finger and let it bleed on the rug or the side of the boat or the edge of the camera. Also, how easy to take from the head of Roberta 2 or 3 hairs and thread them between the sides of the camera, or about the rollock to which her veil had been attached. And after doing secret meditation, he actually deciding to visit the Lutz brothers' morgue and secure a few threads of Roberta's hair. For he himself was convinced that Clyde had murdered the girl in cold blood. And for want of a bit of incriminating proof, was such a young, silent, vain crook as this to be allowed to escape? Not if he himself had to twine the hairs about the rollick or inside the lid of the camera, and then call Mason's attention to them as something overlooked. And in consequence, upon the same day that Height and Mason were personally remeasuring the wounds upon Roberta's face and head, Burla slyly threading two of Roberta's hairs in between the door and the lens of the camera, so that Mason and Height a little while later unexpectedly coming upon them, and wondering why they had not seen them before, nevertheless accepting them immediately as conclusive evidence of Clyde's guilt. Indeed, Mason thereupon announcing that insofar as he was concerned, his case was complete. He had truly traced out every step in this crime and if need be was prepared to go to trial on the morrow. Yet, because of the very completeness of the testimony, deciding for the present, at least, not to say anything in connection with the camera, to seal, if possible, the mouth of everyone who knew. For, assuming that Clyde persisted in denying that he had carried a camera, or that his own lawyer should be unaware of the existence of such evidence, then how damning in court, and out of a clear sky, to produce this camera, these photographs of Roberta made by him, and the proof that the very measurements of one side of the camera coincided with the size of the wounds upon her face. How complete! How incriminating! Also, since he personally having gathered the testimony was the one best fitted to present it, he decided to communicate with the governor of the state for the purpose of obtaining a special term of the Supreme Court for this district, with its accompanying special session of the local grand jury, which would then be subject to his call at any time. For with this granted, he would be able to impanel a grand jury and in the event of a true bill being returned against Clyde, then within a month or 6 weeks, proceed to trial. Strictly to himself, however, he kept the fact that in view of his own approaching nomination in the ensuing November election this should all prove most opportune, since in the absence of any such special term the case could not possibly be tried before the succeeding regular January term of the Supreme Court, by which time he would be out of office and although possibly elected to the local judgeship still not able to try the case in person. And in view of the state of public opinion, which was most bitterly and vigorously anti-Clyde, a quick trial would seem fair and logical to everyone in this local world. For why delay? Why permit such a criminal to sit about and speculate on some plan of escape? And especially when his trial by him, Mason, was certain to rebound to his legal and political and social fame the country over. Chapter 12. And then out of the North Woods a crime sensation of the first magnitude, with all of those intriguingly colorful, and yet morally and spiritually atrocious, elements, love, romance, wealth, poverty, death. And at once picturesque accounts of where and how Clyde had lived in Lycurgus, with whom he had been connected, how he had managed to conceal his relations with one girl while obviously planning to elope with another, being wired for and published by that type of editor so quick to sense the national news value of crimes such as this. And telegrams of inquiry pouring in from New York, Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, San Francisco and other large American cities east and west, either to Mason direct or the representatives of the Associated or United Press in this area, asking for further and more complete details of the crime. Who was this beautiful wealthy girl with whom it was said this Griffiths was in love? Where did she live? What were Clyde's exact relations with her? Yet Mason, overawed by the wealth of the Finchleys and the Griffiths, loath to part with Sandra's name, simply asserting for the present that she was the daughter of a very wealthy manufacturer in Lycurgus, whose name he did not care to furnish, yet not hesitating to show the bundle of letters carefully tied with a ribbon by Clyde. But Roberta's letters on the other hand being described in detail, even excerpts of some of them, the more poetic and gloomy being furnished the press for use, for who was there to protect her? And on their publication a wave of hatred for Clyde as well as a wave of pity for her, the poor, lonely, country girl who had had no one but him, and he cruel, faithless, a murderer even. Was not hanging too good for him? For en route to and from Bear Lake, as well as since, Mason had pored over these letters. And because of certain intensely moving passages relating to her home life, her gloomy distress as to her future, her evident loneliness and weariness of heart, he had been greatly moved, and later had been able to convey this feeling to others, his wife and Height and the local newspaper men. So much so that the latter in particular were sending from Bridgeburg vivid, if somewhat distorted, descriptions of Clyde, his silence, his moodiness, and his hard-heartedness. And then a particularly romantic young reporter from the Star, of Utica arriving at the home of the Aldens, there was immediately given to the world a fairly accurate picture of the weary and defeated Mrs. Alden, who, too exhausted to protest or complain, merely contented herself with a sincere and graphic picture of Roberta's devotion to her parents, her simple ways of living, her modesty, morality, religious devotion, how once the local pastor of the Methodist Church had said that she was the brightest and prettiest and kindest girl he had ever known, and how for years before leaving home she had been as her mother's own right hand. And that undoubtedly because of her poverty and loneliness in Lycurgus, she had been led to listen to the honeyed words of this scoundrel, who, coming to her with promises of marriage, had lured her into this unhallowed and, in her case, all but unbelievable relationship which had led to her death. For she was good and pure and sweet and kind always. And to think that she is dead. I can't believe it. It was so that her mother was quoted. Only Monday a week ago she was about, a little depressed, I thought, but smiling, and for some reason which I thought odd at the time went all over the place Monday afternoon and evening, looking at things and gathering some flowers. And then she came over and put her arms around me and said, "I wish I were a little girl again, Mama, and that you would take me in your arms and rock me like you used to." And I said, "Why, Roberta, what makes you so sad tonight, anyhow?" And she said, "Oh, nothing. You know I'm going back in the morning. And somehow I feel a little foolish about it tonight." And to think that it was this trip that was in her mind. I suppose she had a premonition that all would not work out as she had planned. And to think he struck my little girl, she who never could harm anything, not even a fly. And here, in spite of herself, and with the sadentitis in the background, she began to cry silently. But from the Griffiths and other members of this local social world, complete and almost unbreakable silence. For insofar as Samuel Griffiths was concerned, it was impossible for him at first either to grasp or believe that Clyde could be capable of such a deed. What? That bland and rather timid and decidedly gentlemanly youth, as he saw him, charged with murder? Being rather far from Lycurgus at the time, Upper Saranock, where he was reached with difficulty by Gilbert, he was almost unprepared to think, let alone act. Why, how impossible! There must be some mistake here. They must have confused Clyde with someone else. Nevertheless, Gilbert proceeding to explain that it was unquestionably true, since the girl had worked in the factory under Clyde, and the district attorney at Bridgeburg with whom he had already been in communication had assured him that he was in possession of letters which the dead girl had written to Clyde and that Clyde did not attempt to deny them. "Very well, then," countered Samuel. "Don't act hastily, and above all, don't talk to anyone outside of Smiley or Gotboy until I see you. Where's Brookhart?" Referring to Dara Brookhart, of counsel for Griffiths and Company. "He's in Boston today," returned his son. "I think he told me last Friday that he wouldn't be back here until Monday or Tuesday." "Well, wire him that I want him to return at once. Incidentally, have Smiley see if he can arrange with the editors of the Star and Beacon down there to suspend any comment until I get back. I'll be down in the morning. Also tell him to get in the car and run up there, Bridgeburg, today if he can. I must know from first hand all there is to know. Have him see Clyde if he can, also this district attorney, and bring down any news that he can get and all the newspapers. I want to see for myself what has been published." And at approximately the same time, in the home of the Finchleys on Fourth Lake, Sandra herself, After 48 hours of most macerating thoughts spent brooding on the astounding climax which had put a period to all her girlish fancies in regard to Clyde, deciding at last to confess all to her father, to whom she was more drawn than to her mother. And accordingly approaching him in the library, where usually he sat after dinner, reading or considering his various affairs. But having come within earshot of him, beginning to sob, for truly she was stricken in the matter of her love for Clyde, as well as her various vanities and illusions in regard to her own high position, the scandal that was about to fall on her and her family. Oh, what would her mother say now, after all her warnings? And her father? And Gilbert Griffiths and his affianced bride? And the Cranstons, who except for her influence over Bertine, would never have been drawn into this intimacy with Clyde. Her sobs arresting her father's attention, he at once paused to look up, the meaning of this quite beyond him. Yet instantly sensing something very dreadful, gathering her up in his arms, and consolingly murmuring, "There, there. For heaven's sake, what's happened to my little girl now? Who's done what and why?" And then, with a decidedly amazed and shaken expression, listening to a complete confession of all that had occurred thus far, the first meeting with Clyde, her interest in him, the attitude of the Griffiths, her letters, her love, and then this awful accusation and arrest. And if it were true? And her name were used, and her daddy's. And once more she fell to weeping as though her heart would break, yet knowing full well that in the end she would have her father's sympathy and forgiveness, whatever his subsequent suffering and mood. And at once Finchley, accustomed to peace and order and tact and sense in his own home, looking at his daughter in an astounded and critical and yet not uncharitable way, and exclaiming, "Well, well, of all things. Well, I'll be damned. I am amazed, my dear. I am astounded. This is a little too much, I must say. Accused of murder. And with letters of yours in your own handwriting, you say, in his possession, or in the hands of this district attorney, for all we know by now. TST. 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 Damned foolish, Sandra, damned foolish. Your mother has been talking to me for months about this, and you know I was taking your word for it against hers. And now see what's happened. Why couldn't you have told me or listened to her? Why couldn't you have talked all this over with me before going so far? I thought we understood each other, you and I. Your mother and I have always acted for your own good, haven't we? You know that. Besides, I certainly thought you had better sense. Really, I did. But a murder case, and you connected with it. My God." He got up, a handsome blond man in carefully made clothes, and paced the floor, snapping his fingers irritably, while Sandra continued to weep. Suddenly, ceasing his walking, he turned again toward her and resumed with, "But, there. There's no use crying over it. Crying isn't going to fix it. Of course, we may be able to live it down in some way. I don't know. I can't guess what effect this is likely to have on you personally. But one thing is sure. We do want to know something about those letters." And forthwith, and while Sandra wept on, he proceeded first to call his wife in order to explain the nature of the blow, a social blow that was to lurk in her memory as a shadow for the rest of her years, and next to call up Legare Atterbury, lawyer, state senator, chairman of the Republican State Central Committee and his own private counsel for years past, to whom he explained the amazing difficulty in which his daughter now found herself. Also to inquire what was the most advisable thing to be done. "Well, let me see," came from Atterbury, "I wouldn't worry very much if I were you, Mr. Finchley. I think I can do something to straighten this out for you before any real public damage is done. Now, let me see. Who is the district attorney of Cataraqui County, anyhow? I'll have to look that up and get in touch with him and call you back. But never mind, I promise you I'll be able to do something. Keep the letters out of the papers, anyhow. Maybe out of the trial, I'm not sure, but I am sure I can fix it so that her name will not be mentioned, so don't worry." And then Atterbury in turn calling up Mason, whose name he found in his lawyer's directory, and at once arranging for a conference with him, since Mason seemed to think that the letters were most vital to his case, although he was so much overawed by Atterbury's voice that he was quick to explain that by no means had he planned as yet to use publicly the name of Sandra or the letters either, but rather to reserve their actuality for the private inspection of the grand jury, unless Clyde should choose to confess and avoid a trial. But Atterbury, after referring back to Finchley and finding him opposed to any use of the letters whatsoever, or Sandra's name either, assuring him that on the morrow or the day after he would himself proceed to Bridgeburg with some plans and political information which might cause Mason to think twice before he so much as considered referring to Sandra in any public way. And then after due consideration by the Finchley family, it was decided that at once, and without explanation or apology to anyone, Mrs. Finchley, Stuart and Sandra should leave for the Maine coast or any place satisfactory to them. Finchley himself proposed to return to Lycurgus and Albany. It was not wise for any of them to be about where they could be reached by reporters or questioned by friends. And forthwith, a hegira of the Finchleys to Narragansett, where under the name of Wilson they secluded themselves for the next 6 weeks. Also, and because of the same cause, the immediate removal of the Cranstons to one of the Thousand Islands, where there was a summer colony not entirely unsatisfactory to their fancy. But on the part of the Baggots and the Harriots, the contention that they were not sufficiently incriminated to bother, and so remaining exactly where they were at 12th Lake. But all talking of Clyde and Sandra, this horrible crime and the probable social destruction of all those who had in any way been thus innocently defiled by it. And in the interim, Smiley, as directed by Griffiths, proceeding to Bridgeburg, and after 2 long hours with Mason, calling at the jail to see Clyde. And because of authorization from Mason being permitted to see him quite alone in his cell. Smiley having explained that it was not the intention of the Griffiths to try to set up any defense for Clyde, but rather to discover whether under the circumstances there was a possibility for a defense, Mason had urged upon him the wisdom of persuading Clyde to confess, since, as he insisted, there was not the slightest doubt as to his guilt, and a trial would but cost the county money without result to Clyde, whereas if he chose to confess, there might be some undeveloped reasons for clemency, at any rate, a great social scandal prevented from being aired in the papers. And thereupon Smiley proceeding to Clyde in his cell, where brooding most darkly and hopelessly he was wondering how to do. Yet at the mere mention of Smiley's name shrinking as though struck. The Griffiths, Samuel Griffiths and Gilbert. Their personal representative. And now what would he say? For no doubt, as he now argued with himself, Smiley, having talked with Mason, would think him guilty. And what was he to say now? What sort of a story tell? The truth or what? But without much time to think, for even while he was trying to do so Smiley had been ushered into his presence. And then moistening his dry lips with his tongue, he could only achieve, "Why, how do you do, Mr. Smiley?" To which the latter replied, with a mock geniality, "Why, hello, Clyde, certainly sorry to see you tied up in a place like this." And then continuing, "The papers and the district attorney over here are full of a lot of stuff about some trouble you're in, but I suppose there can't be much to it, there must be some mistake, of course. And that's what I'm up here to find out. Your uncle telephoned me this morning that I was to come up and see you to find out how they come to be holding you. Of course, you can understand how they feel down there. So they wanted me to come up and get the straight of it so as to get the charge dismissed, if possible. So now if you'll just let me know the ins and outs of this, you know, that is," he paused there, confident because of what the district attorney had just told him, as well as Clyde's peculiarly nervous and recessive manner, that he would not have very much that was exculpatory to reveal. And Clyde, after moistening his lips once more, beginning with, "I suppose things do look pretty bad for me, Mr. Smiley. I didn't think at the time that I met Miss Alden that I would ever get into such a scrape as this. But I didn't kill her, and that's the God's truth. I never even wanted to kill her or take her up to that lake in the first place. And that's the truth, and that's what I told the district attorney. I know he has some letters from her to me, but they only show that she wanted me to go away with her, not that I wanted to go with her at all." He paused, hoping that Smiley would stamp this with his approval of Faith. And Smiley, noting the agreement between his and Mason's assertions, yet anxious to placate him, returned, "Yes, I know. He was just showing them to me." "I knew he would," continued Clyde, weakly. "But you know how it is sometimes, Mr. Smiley." His voice, because of his fears that the sheriff or crowd were listening, pitched very low. "A man can get in a jam with a girl when he never even intended to at first. You know that yourself. I did like Roberta at first, and that's the truth, and I did get in with her just as those letters show. But you know that rule they have down there, that no one in charge of a department can have anything to do with any of the women under him. Well, that's what started all the trouble for me, I guess. I was afraid to let anyone know about it in the first place, you see." "Oh, I see." And so by degrees, and growing less and less tense as he proceeded, since Smiley appeared to be listening with sympathy, he now outlined most of the steps of his early intimacy with Roberta, together with his present defense. But with no word as to the camera, or the two hats or the lost suit, which things were constantly and enormously troubling him. How could he ever explain these, really? And with Smiley at the conclusion of this, and because of what Mason had told him, asking, "But what about those two hats, Clyde? This man over here was telling me that you admit to having two straw hats, the one found on the lake and the one you wore away from there." And Clyde, forced to say something, yet not knowing what, replying, "But they're wrong as to my wearing a straw hat away from there, Mr. Smiley, it was a cap." "I see. But still you did have a straw hat up at Bear Lake, he tells me." "Yes, I had one there, but as I told him, that was the one I had with me when I went up to the Cranstons the first time. I told him that. I forgot it and left it there." "Oh, I see. But now there was something about a suit, a gray one, I believe, that he says you were seen wearing up there but that he can't find now? Were you wearing one?" "No. I was wearing the blue suit I had on when I came down here. They've taken that away now and given me this one. But he says that you say you had it dry cleaned at Sharon but that he can't find anyone there who knows anything about it. How about that? Did you have it dry cleaned there?" "Yes, sir." "By whom?" "Well, I can't just remember now. But I think I can find the man if I were to go up there again. He's near the depot," but at the same time looking down and away from Smiley. And then Smiley, like Mason before him, proceeding to ask about the bag in the boat, and whether it had not been possible, if he could swim to shore with his shoes and suit on, for him to have swam to Roberta and assisted her to cling to the overturned boat. And Clyde explaining, as before, that he was afraid of being dragged down, but adding now, for the first time, that he had called to her to hang on to the boat, whereas previously he had said that the boat drifted away from them. And Smiley recalled that Mason had told him this. Also, in connection with Clyde's story of the wind blowing his hat off, Mason had said he could prove by witnesses, as well as the U.S. government reports, that there was not a breath of air stirring on that most halcyon day. And so, plainly, Clyde was lying. His story was too thin. Yet Smiley, not wishing to embarrass him, kept saying, "Oh, I see," or, "To be sure," or "That's the way it was it?" And then finally asking about the marks on Roberta's face and head. For Mason had called his attention to them and insisted that no blow from a boat would make both abrasions. But Clyde sure that the boat had only struck her once and that all the bruises had come from that, or else he could not guess from what they had come. But then beginning to see how hopeless was all this explanation. For it was so plain from his restless, troubled manner that Smiley did not believe him. Quite obviously he considered his not having aided Roberta as dastardly, a thin excuse for letting her die. And so, too weary and disheartened to lie more, finally ceasing. And Smiley, too sorry and disturbed to wish to catechize or confuse him further, fidgeting and fumbling and finally declaring, "Well, I'm afraid I'll have to be going now, Clyde. The roads are pretty bad between here and Sharon." But I've been mighty glad to hear your side of it. And I'll present it to your uncle just as you have told it to me. But in the meantime, if I were you, I wouldn't do any more talking than I could help, not until you hear further from me. I was instructed to find an attorney up here to handle this case for you, if I could, but since it's late and Mr. Brookhart, our chief counsel, will be back tomorrow, I think I'll just wait until I can talk to him. So if you'll take my advice, you'll just not say anything until you hear from him or me. Either he'll come or he'll send someone, he'll bring a letter from me, whoever he is, and then he'll advise you. And with this parting admonition, leaving Clyde to his thoughts and himself feeling no least doubt of his guilt and that nothing less than the Griffiths' millions, if so they chose to spend them, could save him from a fate which was no doubt due him,